Καλημέρα σε όλους. Είμαι ο Γιώργος Καρναβάς και είμαι παραγωγός ταινιών και είμαι εδώ για να παρουσιάσω τον κύριο Σάιμον Πέρι και το ACE, το οποίο είναι ένα εκπαιδευτικό network, θα το χαρακτήριζα, που συμμετείχα το 2011 και ήταν η πρώτη μου, σαν να το λέμε, πόρτα που άνοιξε για να δω πώς λειτουργεί το σύστημα συμπαραγωγής στην Ευρώπη και τι σημαίνει το να είσαι παραγωγός. Το μόνο που έχω να πω είναι ότι είναι κάτι που το συνιστώ ανεπιφύλακτα σε όποιον έχει τη δυνατότητα και την επιθυμία να το κάνει. Και θα αφήσω τον Σάιμον να πει αυτά που θέλει να πει για να παρουσιάσει το πώς δουλεύει και το τι ακριβώς ψάχνουν στο ACE.
Thank you, Yorgos. Good morning, everybody. Yes, I'm going to talk to you about ACE. ACE actually stands for, it's ACE, okay? It stands for Ateliers du Cinéma Européen, which means European Film Workshops. And I'm afraid that name doesn't really tell you anything about us. It is, as Yorgos has said, fundamentally a training organization. But I will talk about how it's evolved and what it has developed into, because actually ACE now is quite a lot more than simply something that offers training. It offers training for producers, and I should say that it offers advanced training for producers. That means the producers who come and go through our training program are producers who already have quite a lot of experience. It's quite distinct and different from EAVE, which, if you were here yesterday, you heard Jacques talking about EAVE, which is a training program for producers, European producers, who are at a quite early stage in their career. The producers who come to ACE are at a later stage. They're not necessarily super experienced, although we've been getting some remarkably accomplished producers joining us recently, but they have produced at least one feature film. And now, because it's quite competitive, typically the ACE producer is somebody who has already produced 2 or 3 or 4 films, feature films, as the delegate producer, and they choose to come to ACE in order to expand their horizons, to get more international information, and to get a sense of how, as Yorgos said, to co-produce effectively, where the money is, how to use it, how to develop international financing strategies. But I think it's helpful if I start by giving you a little bit of history. Not just for the sake of history itself, the anecdotes, but really to explain to you the principles that informed ACE at the very beginning. This was actually quite interesting for me to have the opportunity to do this because, you know, ACE was started actually 20 years ago. I was one of the founders. And it's developed and it's evolved, and I realized that many of the original principles that informed ACE and encouraged us to start ACE are still there in the way that we work and in the new ideas that we have and the new programs that we add each year. ACE started, as I say, 20 years ago. It's our 20th birthday this year, actually. And it was started by somebody who maybe one or two of you would know. He's a great man called Colin Young. He's a Scotsman, and he had been the director of the National Film and Television School in Britain, in Great Britain. He was retiring, and he had an idea that as Europe was coming together, you remember in 1992, the barriers to trade finally came down, and the European Union, in a sense, was born. It was starting to be born, and Europe was starting to expand. New countries were joining. 1992 was an important watershed year in the history of Europe from the point of view of an integrated part of the world. And Colin had the idea that we should somehow respond to this and make use of new money that was being made available through a program called Media, which I'm sure you now are all very familiar with, the Media program based in Brussels. He thought we should try to devise some kind of training program which would insist upon the importance of the creative producer. This was really the fundamental idea. We were looking at a continent, a lot of countries that made a lot of films, had a great filmmaking tradition, mostly that tradition was based on the idea of the director as the filmmaker, the director as the author, the auteur in the French word that became used. And the position of the producer in many countries in Europe was really not much more than a production manager, someone who wrote checks, hired the crew, organized the shoot, did all the logistics. The producer in many, many cinemas around Europe was not expected to have a creative position in the process of making a film. The film creatively belonged to the director. The producer was there to fix things up for the director to work. Colin felt that one good idea, which was more prevalent in the Anglo-Saxon world, in the UK and in America, of course, one good idea was the notion of a creative collaboration between the producer and the director. That in a way, perhaps, ideally, a film should be made by two people. Yes, by the director, who is going to have artistic control of the venture, but with the collaboration of a producer who could make the director, the writer, and the director, often the same person, aware of the market that the film would be addressing. And I use these words rather carefully. We're not saying films that are made in a kind of enslavement to the market, just to please the market. We're talking about making films that European directors, filmmakers would want to make, expressive films, but which would be made with a better knowledge of, a better awareness of, a better sense of the audience, particularly the audience in other countries, that the film would eventually try to reach. One of the reasons that we thought this was important, Colin thought was important, and those of us who joined him in this venture we thought was important, was that at the time, at the early 90s, it was statistically discovered that only 8% of films made in a European country, any European country, were shown in another European country. Films made in Europe were tending to be made and shown within their own borders and were not reaching out even to neighboring countries in Europe, let alone further afield in the rest of the world. And this idea, therefore, of increasing an awareness of the market in the making of a film seemed to us something that was quite urgent, quite important, and which could be something usefully part of this integrated European project to reflect the idea that we would now all be able much more easily to work together and to send our products, our films, our whatever, across borders, if only other people in other countries would be encouraged to buy them. And this would mean making the films perhaps with a better awareness of the tastes, of the experience, of the cultures, of the countries that we would be trying to reach in this way. As I say, this was quite an Anglo-Saxon concept in a way. And those of us who were in at the beginning thinking about ACE, we thought we had to go carefully here because we don't want to look like Anglo-Saxons trying to impose an idea on our European neighbors and partners. This would not be helpful. We did think it was a good idea at least to test it, but we didn't want necessarily simply, to introduce it and impose it. And I, for one, felt very strongly that if we based ACE, this new idea that actually at the time didn't even yet have a name, but if we made the base, the headquarters of ACE in England, in London, then it would look very much like an Anglo-Saxon concept, and many countries probably would not be encouraged to take it seriously. Producers would not necessarily want to join us, train with us, and in particular, I felt, because I had some knowledge of the French industry where I had worked, I thought the French won't join this. The French will see this as an American plot, and they will deliberately refuse to be part of it. So it seemed to me very important that the headquarters of ACE should not be in London. Ideally, I felt it should be in Paris. Because if it was in Paris, the French had to notice it and had to at least be curious about it. They couldn't ignore it. We set up a working group. Colin had the idea, Colin Young, but we set up a working group which consisted of a good many people. some of them I realize now, quite well-known people in later careers. David Putnam, British producer, and René Klitman. Sadly, he died a few years ago, but he was a great French producer. Roberto Cicuto, Italian distributor, still very active. Dieter Koslik, then running an organization in the north of Germany, which provided funding for distribution. Now, of course, he's the director of the Berlinale, where he's been for some years. These were some of the original people on our working group. And I actually was the chair of the working group. We had several meetings. We decided to do some research. We sent a guy around Europe to interview people, to interview professionals, producers, but also distributors, and people everywhere in the profession, to talk about, to get from them, get an idea from them, whether this idea of the creative producer, of a creative collaboration between the producer and the director in the making of Europe's films, if that had some value. And he came back rather strongly with the notion that this was going to catch on, that this was going to be popular with people, with a number of countries. And in particular, we were looking further ahead to when the countries of Central and Eastern Europe would be joining the European Union. And of course, under that system, under the communist system, it was a completely studio system. The money went through the studio to the director, and the producer was simply a production manager. So we thought, when those countries come into Europe, we really want to try to encourage a different kind of collaboration between the producer and the director, and we felt that for those countries, ACE could be particularly useful. So as a result of this research and the working party meetings, we got money from media. Fortunately, we had to convince them. They were a little skeptical at first. But we decided to set ACE up, and I managed to persuade my colleagues on the working party that we should indeed set it up in France. And we managed to get the city of Paris, in fact, to give us a very nice set of offices at that time just opposite the Hôtel de Ville, and we had the offices for free, and ACE became a reality in 1993. We started a series of workshops. Initially, they were more frequent, actually, than one a year. We now have one course per year, but in those days we did 3 courses every 2 years. So we would have a series of workshops every 8 months. It was quite intensive. Producers did join us. The first French producer to join us, I think in the first or second course, said he would join us as long as his name was kept secret from all his French colleagues, because he didn't want other French producers knowing that he had decided to join this rather Anglo-Saxon smelling program. But later, French producers, younger French producers with a more international perspective, many of them have joined us. And in fact, one of the largest body of producers in our network, and I'll talk about the network in a moment, are French producers. There are also many producers from Germany. Interestingly, rather few and fewer from the UK, although many from Ireland, where the Anglo-Saxon culture could be said to exist. We instituted workshops which were initially about project development. Producers came to ACE with a project, they still do, and the first part of the work is work on the project itself, to assist the producer in knowing how best to develop that project with an eye to an international market, probably an eye to international financing through co-production, but certainly to reach an international market. But as ACE has developed more and more, we have found that actually the best service we can provide is to help producers themselves to develop. Yes, the project development continues, but producer development is, we feel, a very important part of our work. And many of our workshops, and much of the way in which ACE functions, and I'll talk about this in a moment, the practice of ACE, much of that is about enabling producers to develop themselves as creative producers and also to develop their businesses in a useful way. As I said at the beginning, what we offer is advanced training. It's training for people who already know how to produce a film. What they may not know is how to produce a film at a more international level, perhaps with a bigger budget, with more partners, with more international partners. These are the things that ACE can help with by introducing our producers who join the course to many players, many people from different areas of distribution, from television, from agents, from other producers, more senior producers, by exchanging information. And that word exchange, I'll return to in a moment when I talk about the practice of ACE and how ACE actually functions. A very, very big development for ACE was that after about 7-8 years of purely being a training organization, something had started to happen organically, which we then made more systematic. What was happening organically, which by the way has also happened organically at EAVE, the initiative you heard about yesterday, producers, having been through the training process together, want to stay together. They make groups, they make friendships, they make even sometimes partnerships, they talk about co-productions together. And in fact, instinctively and organically, they started to create a network of people who had done the ACE program. We thought this was really interesting as a new area that ACE should positively assist with. And now I would say that the ACE network, and I'd be interested to know, you might want to ask other ACE producers who are here. I should mention the fact that, of course, Γιώργος Καρναβάς is an ACE producer, and I think I see Yorgos Chirianis there, who is also an ACE producer. I saw Alexandra Boussiou yesterday. She was here. I don't know if she's here today. She is a very recently joined ACE producer. Titus Kreinberg, who was intervening in the last session, he is. Thanasis, I see Karatanos there, has been with us for quite a number of years now, Thanasis, I think. And Ed Guiney, the Irish producer who was here yesterday, he's an ACE producer from a good many years ago. You should ask them, because these are all producers who are very active in our network. And what happens is that having done the program of training, which I'll explain in a moment, after that year of training with ACE, producers have the option, and almost all of them take it, to remain in the ACE network. And the ACE network continues through an annual sequence of support at festivals. We put on surgeries and networking events. We hold professional social evenings, brunches, happy hours, or whatever for the benefit of our producers in the network. And they can also, at any time they want, contact us at the headquarters in Paris for advice on a project or a contact or a way of financing a new fund or whatever. So the network is something that we try to nourish and to maintain and sustain as actively as possible. Because in a way you could say that it's the network which has become the heart of ACE. Yes, it all starts with training, and you can't join the network unless you've been through the training, but it's the network that really gives ACE its character and its authority. And the network is like a club. It's a club of producers who've been through an experience together, and then they liked each other, they want to stay in contact, they've learned to trust each other, they have to trust each other really, and they have to behave themselves, because an ACE producer within the network who is not trustworthy is immediately discovered, and it's not really possible. So you can be sure that if you contact other people in the club, in the ACE network, you can rely on them, and you'll get an answer, and you'll get some good information, and so on. And this has led to a very active sequence of co-productions through the years now, through the last 10, 12 years. Co-productions are very frequently undertaken by producers who are within the ACE network. They produce almost in some cases now systematically together, reciprocally producing each other's films, co-producing each other's films, and so on. Another very important development that took place, continuing the history for a moment, was that the network had become really established in the early part of the century, 2001, 2002. The network was an established part of ACE's activities. But ACE was still funded by media, primarily funded by media, and was open only to producers from the European Union. The European Union, of course, had got considerably bigger, and it got bigger again in the early part of this century. So all those countries from Central and Eastern Europe joined us, other countries also, Malta, Cyprus, and so on. But what had not yet happened was that ACE did not yet have any kind of activity outside the borders of Europe. But in 2009, media, and I must say that it was one of the finest ideas they had, they introduced a new type of funding called Media Mundus. It was called something else originally, international media or something, but it became funding known as Media Mundus. Media Mundus is funding for activities, projects, initiatives which connect Europeans with the rest of the world on a reciprocal basis. ACE was very, very interested in this immediately because we thought the opportunities to introduce non-European producers into our training scheme and then into the network was something that would greatly enrich the network. And so in 2009 and every year since then, we have undertaken training with not so many. We take, as I'll explain in a moment, 16 European producers every year, but we take between 6 and 8 non-European producers into a special course designed for them. It's shorter than the European course, but it enables them, having done that course, coming from wherever they come from, it could be Australia, New Zealand, Canada, Mexico, Colombia, China, India, Israel, and those countries in Europe, this is very important, those countries in Europe which are European countries but don't happen yet to be members of the European Union. I'm thinking of Bosnia, I'm thinking of Serbia, Macedonia, and so on. We've had producers also coming on the Media Mundus program, the ACE Mundus program, from those countries. And so a few non-European producers, non-EU producers have joined the network every year. And this has had a tremendous, I think, as I say, enriching effect on the network, and has also increased the opportunities for our European producers to think about co-productions with Canada or Australia or wherever. That's, I think, those two things, the development of the network from something organic into something more systematic, and then the addition of non-European producers to the network. These are the two major events in the opening up and the development, the improvement, if you like, of the authority of ACE and the help, the assistance, the support that it can give to its producers. I'll mention one other thing also, which is that philosophically, this is something that's been very much a concern of mine in the last couple of years. Philosophically, you know, the world of independent filmmaking needs quite a lot of thought more than simply helping independent film producers to survive and work better. I think the whole world in which independent film producers are obliged to function and try to make films, it needs attention, it needs constant monitoring, and I think it's a responsibility of an organization like ACE to think about ways in which ACE, with the authority of all our producers in our network behind us, and with the authority of the voice which in a way they give to ACE, what can we do to improve, to enable the funding, the financing strategies, and the market for independent films to be at least not allowed anymore to deteriorate, but perhaps to be improved. It's a big call. It's very tough because, you know, we're working in the margins. The mainstream is taken by the films from the big production centers, Hollywood, Bollywood. Independent filmmaking is really, it's almost a marginal business now, if it's a business at all. And it's mostly, entirely dependent on public money. That's not necessarily unhealthy in itself, but it's a strange fact of life that independent filmmaking is now totally dependent on public money. But it means also that the responsibility on public funders, people who manage public money, I believe the responsibility on them, and I've done quite a lot of this myself. I ran the National Fund in Britain for 10 years, and then later the National Fund in Ireland for 5 years. So I have some experience of this. But I believe that people who manage public money for the support of independent filmmaking need always to be encouraged to raise their game, to do that work with, in a more enlightened way, with more information, and with more commitment and with more cunning, more strategy, more looking ahead. Anything, any initiative that can encourage public funders to do the job better seems to me something worth encouraging or considering. So at ACE, we've introduced something which we've just started with a workshop in February this year. I won't go into a lot of detail about this. We can talk about it later if there's time or individually. But it's a new initiative which is not for producers, although producers do contribute to it. It's actually for people who run funding agencies. It was a workshop that we held in Israel in February called Best Practice Exchange. And Best Practice Exchange brought together for the first workshop 20 heads, only heads. We wouldn't accept deputies, number twos, assistants, nobody. Had to be the person who runs the national film agency or the regional film agency at the table. Those people came together for 2 days of brainstorming, exchanging experiences, and talking about how mutually and collectively they can raise their game, what areas of public funding need addressing, where it could be better, more effective, more useful, more attuned to the market, and so on. It was a very, very interesting couple of days. We produced a report as a result, and it's called When Cinema Hangs by a Thread, because it was stated during the workshop that independent cinema hangs by a thread now, and the thread is the funding that was in that room when we were holding that workshop. And that's just an example of an initiative which ACE has instigated for the general wider benefit of independent filmmaking and independent producers. We had some ACE producers join us for the workshop for some of the sessions. Their input was very, very useful and important. It was an initiative which we want to continue and which I believe is within the responsibility of ACE, because it's not just about supporting producers, although that's the core business of what we do, but helping to improve the climate. The world in which we're all trying to work seems to us to be something that ACE should not forget. I'll talk now a bit about the practice of ACE, and I gave you the title of that workshop for funders as Best Practice Exchange, and I mentioned earlier that the word exchange is very important in the ACE philosophy. We do not invite experts. We do not invite teachers. We don't invite people who know to come and talk to our producers who don't know. At ACE, there is no them and us. We're not pedagogical in that sense. We don't have information delivered and information received. We have essentially information and experience exchanged. ACE is always, every workshop, we always say this, is a coming together of people who all have some level of experience, some great, some not quite so great, but still very significant, often very particular, specific to a country, a culture, a language, a cinema. And it's this exchange of information among our producers who are going through the training process, at least that's how it's described, and our consultants, which is the word that we usually use because it's a neutral word. We don't use the word teachers or experts, I would emphasize. It's exchange of information between those people. So our workshops are often, 50 people in a room who are contributing to the process of perhaps the analysis of a finance plan or the discussion of a type of funding like tax incentives or something, and everybody is pitching in, everybody is contributing their information for the benefit of everybody else in the room. And we say at ACE, and it sounds cute, but it's actually fundamental to the way ACE works, that at ACE, nobody teaches, but everybody learns. Because everybody has something, we believe, to teach or to share and exchange with other people. And I just want to emphasize that, because if you do contemplate ACE, you should know that's how it works, and you should know that we will consider, in asking you to join the ACE course as a producer, we will consider not only whether your project is something we can help with, whether you come from an interesting part of Europe that would be of interest to have for us in the workshop, not only whether we can contribute to your development as a producer, but how much you would have to offer to other people, to other producers, and to other people in the workshop at the time, what you would bring as well as what you would take away. As I mentioned, media provides the majority of our money, and our main workshop, or our larger workshop of the year, is for European Union producers, including, by the way, Switzerland, because they are in the media program. And we have a separate workshop for non-EU producers, but then, as I'll explain, the schedule of the year enables everybody to come together at a certain point in the year, the EU producers and the non-EU producers. I should say in passing that apart from media, ACE is funded by another 7, 8 sources at the moment from different parts of Europe. We are very strongly supported in France, partly because we're based there, but also because CNC has been particularly faithful to us. We are well supported from Germany. We're well supported actually from Sweden, and we receive a small amount of support still from Italy. Some countries have been more difficult. Ireland is still faithful to us, although they're going through very great difficulties financially, as you know, and not unlike what's been happening here. But we therefore have a patchwork of financing which we're always trying to hold together. But what has really enabled us to have a more stable business recently is we have introduced a number of outside Europe activities. We've introduced workshops in Hong Kong, in Japan, in Latin America, and as I say, we've been bringing non-EU producers into our training program. This has meant we've also been well funded by media through the Mundus, the Media Mundus program. This is a slight problem for us immediately because media is going to be transformed into a new organization, probably you know this, called Creative Europe, and the transition is going to be a little bit awkward in the sense that there's going to be a year, namely next year, where there's not going to be any money for non-European activities. We're feeling the pinch of this very hard at ACE. It's going to be a cold year for us next year because those activities I've mentioned in China and in Japan and Latin America, for example, we will not be able to raise any money from media for those activities next year. So we're slightly in survival mode at the moment, but it's only temporary. And we do know that, thank you very much, media does consider us to be a center of excellence and will certainly recommend to Creative Europe that the support for ACE is continued. And I think within, by 2015, everything will even out, and those non-European activities, which are very important to us, will be back on track. We select and bring into the European training program 16 EU producers, plus Switzerland, every year, and 6 to 8 non-EU producers. That's the basis. It is selective, it is competitive. If you have produced 4 or more feature films as the delegate producer, you do not necessarily have to come to an interview. But if you have produced less than that, and you must have produced at least 1 feature film as a delegate producer to be qualified, in that case you will be invited, if you are shortlisted, to an interview. We've just last week, 10 days ago, 2 weeks ago, we made the selection for the next round of workshops. We've selected 16 new producers. We make the selection of non-EU producers later, at the turn of the year, and that's done in partnership with agencies in the countries from which producers come. So in partnership with Telefilm Canada, Screen Australia, the agency in Mexico, Pro Imágenes in Colombia, and so on. They work with us to propose 1 or 2 producers each year from whom we would probably choose 1 from each country, except in Canada, where we choose 1 Anglophone and 1 Francophone. The European producers have 3 workshops. It's a little bit like EAVE in that sense. They're a little bit more close together than EAVE because our workshops are, first one's coming up in October, another in November, it's the main workshop, and then a follow-up workshop in March of next year. So across this period from October to March, the ACE European program is completed, and the producers will go through a workshop in each of those months. The workshops are roughly a week long, 6 days, something like that. And the first workshop is mainly devoted to the material, the project that the producer brings, assistance with that development. There's some theoretical work, but it's mostly very practical work on the actual project, one-to-one meetings and also group meetings. The second workshop is primarily about financing sources and financing strategies. It's a big workshop. There are, as I say, 50, sometimes 60 people there. Funders join the workshop, many of them, also broadcasters, distributors, sales agents, and so on, and other producers from the network very often. Because we have found at ACE that some of the best information that producers can derive is from other producers. You can learn much more often about how a funding system works in another country from a producer from that country than from the person who runs the fund coming and giving you a lecture about how to apply. It's the producers who have the really good knowledge, and that's what we aim to promote the exchange of. October, November and March, as I say, and the non-EU producers are selected later because they join their workshop in March at roughly the same time as the third workshop for the European producers. In actual fact, what happens is there's a workshop specially for non-EU producers, which is 3 days long, and then there's a workshop for everybody, the European and non-European producers. They meet and all join up, and then that's followed by a weekend, which is our annual reunion for those producers who've just joined from Europe, from outside Europe, and also any other producers from the network who are able to attend. That third workshop is held in a different city somewhere in Europe every year. This year it was in Helsinki. Recently we've been in Zurich and Amsterdam, in Bucharest, and so on. We choose that partly with money in mind, because the country and the city where we'll go needs to be a financial partner for the activity. It's quite a big event. We get normally about 60, 70 producers, new producers and producers from the network, who are all there for the big reunion weekend. And I know that Yorgos, you've been to these weekends, you know what they're like. And that's the kind of culmination, if you like, of the ACE year, where the European producers, the non-European producers, and the producers from the network can really come, mix, and exchange ideas and network, and talk about co-productions, which they very often do. So we're providing this support intensively on a training basis for the first year in each case of each group, but of course the support goes on for the network throughout the rest of the year. You may wonder, is there on what basis do you join the network when you've been through the training? You have to pay, if you want to stay in the network, you have to pay a small amount of money each year. It's at the moment 700 euros. It's not enormous. And actually, if you elect not to come to the annual reunion, I believe we've reduced the network fee to 250 euros, because it's the annual reunion that really costs the money. But most producers, active producers, who are in a business that's at least working, they're able to find that money each year. And we can count now in the network roughly 150 active producers. It's not everybody who's ever joined, who's ever trained with us. Some producers change their activity, they move into television, they decide they're going to make more money in commercials. One or two, even because we've been going for 20 years, one or two producers have died. One or two, some have left the business altogether. But everybody who stays in the business and continues to want to make feature films, by and large, they stay in the network. And ACE provides, as I say, at film festivals and at regular intervals during the year, there are events that can provide new information and new support for the producers in the network. I should emphasize that, and I think I said this before, but probably a good idea to say it again, that access into ACE, being selected for ACE, is more and more competitive. And each year now, and we want to encourage this, we are selecting producers with more and more experience. And it more or less means that unless you are pretty experienced, typically in your own country, the typical profile of a producer coming to ACE is someone who's been rather successful in his or her own country, made films which have worked, but now wants to work at a more international level, perhaps with bigger budgets. ACE can provide that stepping stone, that step up into a wider field of action. So it is now really for producers who have a pretty good experience of how to make film, how to produce a film, but really want to widen that experience and get into co-production in an even more systematic and professional way. I mentioned earlier that we are for producers who are at a further advanced stage than producers who go to EAVE. There's another program that was born at the same time as us, and actually was a kind of sister program of ours for a while, called the Media Business School, which is based in Spain. It's based in Madrid, and it typically has workshops in a lovely town called Ronda in the south of Spain. We have very good relations with Media Business School, and we often encourage our producers to go there. It's very specifically about the business of the business, as it were, but it's a separate activity, and there's no necessary connection between the two programs. Although I would say Media Business School, by and large, is for producers with a bit less experience than come to ACE. There's a very big crossover of producers who've done both. And of course, there are many producers who do EAVE and then come to ACE 2, 3, 4, 5 years later. Okay, I'll just finish by talking a little bit about the character of ACE and of an ACE producer. I think if you look at our producers and the work they do and the films of theirs which are selected for festivals and so on, they, I guess, are producers of feature films which are made more or less within the European tradition of auteur cinema. Not exclusively, and we have some producers who are fairly successfully making genre films, perhaps, on a more Anglo-Saxon model. But typically, the successful ACE producer is a producer who collaborates creatively with an auteur producer to make films which, in the best sense, best occasions, turn out to be crossover films, as they're known. In other words, they are European auteur films which are made with an eye to the market, and if they're well made, they find that market. They cross over, they get picked up by strong sales agents, they find strong festivals, and they go out across the world. That is, in a way, I suppose, the mainstream ACE producer activity, is that kind of auteur crossover filmmaking. I should say, yes, most of the information, most of our producers are in the field of working in fiction feature films. Most of our producers are in that area, but more and more the work we do and the exchange of information does make reference to work in creative documentaries. We don't have workshops specifically about documentaries, but documentaries are becoming so much a strong and undeniable part of expressive cinema that ACE is more and more concerned with and providing information about that activity and showcases for those kind of films. What's more difficult is to be very, very helpful to producers who specialize in animation, because it's so very specific. We have some, they often make feature films and animation films, particularly if they're interested in making children's films. And children's films and producers interested in making children's films is an area that we at ACE positively want to develop. I should signal that. Animation, though, the opportunities for ACE to help an animation producer specifically and in depth are quite limited, I have to admit that. So we're mostly concerned with feature films. We don't, I should say, apart from whether there's money in broadcasters for feature films, we don't concern ourselves with TV drama. Although now, with genre filmmaking, looking at what's been happening in Scandinavia, for example, we're looking at that material, at the work that's being done for television. And the more successful genre work on film seems to be finding its home in television in Europe, and that's very interesting to us and something we've been talking about. Yes, co-production is a financing strategy that we talk about in our workshops in a lot of depth. ACE is very profoundly about co-production, there's no question about it. It's about people knowing each other and co-producing together, and it's about the information you need to do that. As I've also suggested in talking about best practice exchange, we are very concerned at ACE as the staff and at the headquarters, as it were, to keep a very strong eye on the evolving market. The market is evolving very fast, very disconcertingly, in some ways encouragingly, but not as encouragingly as it could. The new distribution platforms are something of intense interest to us, and they find their way, those strands of knowledge and information very much find their way into our workshops. So we feel that, to be at the very forefront of monitoring and knowing about the way the market is evolving is something that we're very much obliged to. It's a place we're obliged to be and work that we must undertake. I hope I've covered most of what you would be wanting to ask as questions, but if you have any other questions, I don't know if we have any time, Giorgos, but that's an outline anyway of ACE and how we function.
If there's any question, we can have one-to-one outside.
Okay.
Because we're running late.
Okay. As you want. Thank you very much.